Today on Distillers Talk, we have an all-star cast. We're bringing you a panel discussion with 4 experts in their respective fields, some return guests, and another making his debut on our show. We're focusing on 2 topics today that draw back from the history of whiskey in the US, Rosen Rye and the 3-chamber still. We'll even be hitting on some controversy relating to these 2 topics. But before we get into that, I want to introduce our guests. So first we have Laura Fields from the Delaware Valley Fields Foundation. Erik Wolfe from Stoll Wolfe, Pennsylvania. Robert McDonald from Dancing Star Farms. And Todd Leopold, Leopold Brothers. And of course, Alan.
It's a very Lexington, Kentucky pronunciation thing happening there, for sure. It's seeped into you now.
It's like saying Louisville.
Yes, Louisville.
On the topic of Wolfe, we actually do have a little tasting we're going to be doing today too. Erik sent out the sample of the 2-year Rosen Rye they have going on. So we'll all get to taste that today and give our thoughts on it. But Alan, before we get any further, I'm going to hand this one over to you and kind of talk a little bit more about why we're all here today.
Sure. So don't ever let anybody tell you that complaining won't get you anywhere. Because every time I complain on Facebook, it becomes some sort of productive conversation, which is what led to this evening. So what led to this evening is I still, after all these years, have not learned my lesson to not watch moonshiners, or to watch it and just take it for what it is. And so there was an episode, I can't, what was the title of it, Laura? I can't remember what it was off the top of my head.
Rebel Rye.
Rebel Rye, okay. And it was cool because Robert McDonald was on there, who I know, and Laura was on there, who I know, and they did a great job of getting the word out about Pennsylvania having been a distilling state, and the history of distilling in Pennsylvania and the Rosen Rye project, which I want to let you guys all talk about as well. And overall, it was awesome to see them on there and also to get the great information out to the public in general. And then the part that didn't involve them was maybe like the worst piece of an episode I ever saw, because they just slaughtered the 3-chamber, which I know that most people aren't going to know one way or the other, but obviously Todd has spent a lot of time promoting the 3-chamber and bringing it back to prominence. And as a distiller who spent my fair share of time on the illicit distilling / home distilling side of things and has to answer a lot of questions about how to distill and dispel a bunch of rumors about moonshiners on this show, as it were. I had a mini stroke while watching it, and then proceeded to get drunk and post on Facebook, which led to, all right, let's clear the air and get all these experts on here about Rosen Rye and about the 3-chamber and about the history of distilling in Pennsylvania and about grain in general in Pennsylvania. So that way we can hopefully better inform some of these people who are now going to come to me and Todd and Erik and ask these questions that are painful to listen to. So that was the premise from my point of view. I think that's probably a pretty good intro, but you guys feel free to add to that. Okay.
What way?
We're all stumped.
Where to start? I don't know. Bob, what was your experience like?
I enjoyed the actual process, but it was made for TV.
Yeah, yeah, to say the least, right?
Right.
If
the cows that were in the field, that was actual.
Right. The farm was real.
The farm was real.
Fake
That's as far as it got.
Those CG cows.
Well, and just having spoken with everyone on here at one time or another, either via text or in person, I think one of the things that maybe was lost in the episode is just how much everybody really cares about the people, places, and traditions that these things are based on, and the fact that, again, I know, Todd, you were saying that people ask you about when you invented the 3-chamber still, what you were thinking, or when you plan on patenting it, but with so much of it, it's to honor the people that came before us. And it seems like that was one of the main things that they glossed over. And in speaking to us, when they asked if we would help build the 3-chamber, I was just picturing Todd just like strangling me through the phone if that was what. So it's such a challenge. I mean, with Laura and I know, Robert, you guys have done so much and done so much to help preserve the history and to tell the story of PA whiskey. As a fellow PA whiskey nerd, that was sort of the hard thing to watch. It was, I'm sure you guys were putting so much historical stuff out there, and then they were just like, well, let's make a problem for television, essentially.
Absolutely. And that was the point. That was the point of getting you guys together on a panel, is to, because literally that was the first like 30 minutes when you guys were involved. That was the closest they came to me being like, holy shit, they might make it through a whole episode without fucking this whole thing up for everybody. Right. And then just watching the airplane crash. So, but it was good to get you guys out there, you know, and get the word out there. And so now, hopefully, not only Distillers Talk, but other platforms will be coming to you guys as well. Obviously, Todd is blowing up the world right now with his 3 chamber stuff out there. And Pennsylvania is definitely back on the map. But hopefully that episode does spur these kind of conversations, right? To where you can have a panel like this and really get into the importance of the history of it. And for example, when I made that post, my post was legitimately because of the way that they built their quote unquote 3 chamber, which wasn't a 3 chamber at all. I don't know if Todd, if you've seen that episode yet or even bothered with it.
I finally went over and had a look, and I'm like, oh, it's that I was just talking about this with some of the larger distillers, that the history of distilling is so fascinating, and the who's and the what's and I don't understand why people keep making stuff up. But because the story they tell is always it's not as good as a story as the real thing, right? Truth is stranger than fiction. And that's what I don't understand. The actual stories that Laura tells, the actual stories that you'll get from, Mr. Stoll. I mean, break out the popcorn, and then instead of telling that story, you make a bunch of crap up, and it's just disappointing. I get it. It's television. I understand that they're producing a show and the producer's always trying to find some sort of, tension and a protagonist and an antagonist, all the stuff that they try and bake in. And I think that's why, I don't know if you ever seen the British baking show?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And my wife just was, fell in love with it. We watched a ton of it at the start of the pandemic, in particular. Well, it didn't have any of that, but it was still fascinating, right? It wasn't, this person's mean and is hiding the yeast, or whatever the American producers think need to happen in order for it to be interesting television. And as Alan is highlighting, the actual history is it's a story worth telling, and it's fascinating. For me, with the actual 3 chamber stuff, when you talked about patenting it, I saw that, and it's like, that was like one of the times that I wish that I had, just because they'd have to come and call, and so I could say, that's a eau de vie still is what you're making. In Austria, they limit the number of plates that you have so that you can't make high proof, right? So it's they're all 3 plate stills. That's not a coincidence, right? So it's intended to make it so that you're bringing off, you can still get some rectification, you get control with your deflegmator, but you're not making vodka, right? Why that's important to the Germans, I still don't quite understand that. But there's thousands of farm distilling licenses as a result of this, right? We and actually somebody, I read a review where they said, why, and he patented this, which doesn't make any sense. I'm like, no, we didn't patent it. I have no interest in keeping other people from building these stills. But what I do want to happen, this was the part that Scott and I were talking about in terms of trademarking, patented, maybe that's the wrong word. I'm using words interchangeably. Sorry, I'm a bit jet lagged. But to keep this from happening, you know what I mean? So in other words, somebody just uses a regular old pot still or some contraption or whatever, and then dilutes what 3-chamber whiskey is all about. That's what we'd like to be able to protect against, but there's really kind of nothing we can do about it other than Alan Bishop having a couple of drinks, going on the internet and tearing whoever the hell it is a new one, which in many ways is better than a patent.
Shame is an effective tool.
Right. Point me at a target. Yeah. As a real quick aside, here's what I saw on the end of the 3-chamber thing. So what I see is Tim doing what Tim does, and that's fine, right? And you can have a show that's about entertainment and still be able to tell the history and the story, as Todd's saying. But what I see is the number of people who see things on that show, and it does happen. It happens on a very regular basis. I hear from a lot of these home distillers, and they see what has happened on the show, and they see how this 3-chamber has been built, right? Then they go read just enough to be dangerous with it, and that they read, that it's a distillation system that can be, basically rapid fired by chamber. And the first time that one of these guys builds one of them, and it's hot and it's low on liquid, and they drop cold liquid into that thing, and then collapse, and they're going to be lucky if they're not hurt. If nothing else, their investment's gone. But even from the simplest point of view of maybe you don't get hurt, nothing like that happens, you lose a little bit of money, but these people are new to distilling, that's going to turn them away from distilling for the rest of their life. Hey, I just spent $300 on copper to put this thing together, and there it is.
And imploded the whole thing. Yeah,
right.
I've always, you're much more ingrained in the history of moonshining, and I think it's an important part of American history. I look at it from a different perspective, that I'm scared to death when somebody comes in that they're going to hurt themselves. I mean, that's literally what is on my mind. I'm looking at these tiny vents that can clog in a millisecond because it's only, a quarter of an inch wide because it's still so small. That's what goes through my mind, and maybe it's just me being a dad. but that's honestly that when people come in and ask me questions, I demur. I just, the idea of somebody going home and getting hurt just really, I just don't like that thought. We do get a lot of people that are engineers and, that will tell me that. And I still do the same thing. Please don't talk about that, with me. And that makes me feel a little bit better. But even then, I've got an engineer for a brother, and I wouldn't run a still that he built. So, but that's always where my mind's been, Alan, to be honest. And reading your musings and your posts and your shows over the year has helped me kind of pull back on that, that this is a very, very, very American thing to do. It's a very global thing to do. Not to put, but that's where I always go. I go first to safety and just worry about somebody blowing up their kitchen or hurting their kids or, and I guess I think that's just how that's how I'm wired. I mean, I looked at that copper and I'm like, that is some thin copper. So for me immediately, but then he shows how or the idea behind it running, the stresses aren't going to be anywhere close to where it would be on a real 3-chamber still. So that made me feel a little bit better, but we've been on a couple of those. We haven't been on Moonshiner. They invite me. We get invites for that or have over the years. And I just we don't have time. I couldn't step. I don't know how long the filming is for the episodes, and I could never do something like that. And I'm pretty confident I'd lose. I've only been in a commercial environment, right? And the things that you need to do are entirely different. And I'm pretty confident I'd fall on my face if you had me in any of those competitions. competition type shows at all. But I don't know. For me, more than the thing I got out of the episode, what was, there was just such a wonderful chance to tell a little bit more of his story. But you have a producer / director or whoever it is that they have their idea going in as to what it is they want to do. They're professionals. I'm not. And we're a very, I think, specific audience, but I just always think that the truth and I could listen to, Laura talk about, Pennsylvania history until the cows come home. That's a great 30-minute episode to me.
That would have been more. They edited me.
Oh, no, I know. Hey, listen, I always, it took me, I think, about 10 years of interviews before I stopped being nervous on camera or on radio, because they talk to you for 2 hours and you're desperately afraid of saying something wrong, but you don't realize they're going to use 3 words.
Right.
And then when you realize that, it's like, there's nothing to get nervous about.
Yeah.
Because none of it's gonna show up anyway. And if they spell your name right, the last one, there's a book that came out recently where they called my brother Paul multiple times.
Oh boy.
Paul Leopold. I don't know where the hell they came up with that one. So we're not kidding when they say, hey, they spelled our name right. Chalk it up as a media win and move on. Because they don't get the name right. It's pretty crazy, It's a tough business. I couldn't run a TV show, but I think the audience that's here today just has a much different eye. And the history of all those distilleries in Pennsylvania and Maryland that just disappeared. It's crazy to just wrap your head around thinking about that entire industry that was just eviscerated. And I know Laura knows, I mentioned it to her once. I was born in Pennsylvania. I was born in a little city called Warren, Pennsylvania. And the biggest thing so my dad, actually, he was working for the Department of Interior, and he designed a federal park that was along the Allegheny River. That's why I was there. So we lived there for 2-3 years. And the biggest thing I remember about it is that I always called it pencil bacon as a kid. That's my biggest memory is pencil bacon. It's like, oh, well, I'm looking at my dad and going, I'm like, that's when you just gave up and put all your chips on my older brother, right? kept saying pencil bacon. They're like, well, this one's a lost cause.
So I think this might be a good place to bring in a little bit more of what we're talking about here too. And I know we'll probably come back to 3-chamber here shortly, but Erik, you were nice enough to send us excuse me, guys, some samples. So being that we're talking about Rosen Rye, that's probably where we should go. We'll pour some of that. And if you want to talk about that for a minute, Erik, and then as we go through that, Bob and Laura, Bob can obviously talk about growing Rosen. Laura can talk about getting that back up and going as well, the importance of that Rosen Rye to the Pennsylvania industry, etc. And as you do that, if you want to, if you feel inclined to talk about what you would have liked to have had in the show that didn't make it, then this is a great platform to put that there. So I'm trying to be more diplomatic here. I'm trying.
No, it's good because it was our conversation when the whole thing on Facebook, when you were putting up the posts, I was being defensive, but not because of the content of the show itself, because you're right about the 3-chamber and you're right about the way that the story went. But I had a lot to do with how the story was guided, because initially they wanted to do the story about the Whiskey Rebellion. And, that being a secessionist movement and having some kind of negative connotation to it, I wasn't interested in doing the show if it was going to focus on that. And I said, look, I understand, that's something that a lot of Pennsylvania distillers use as their story, and that's wonderful. But Pennsylvania whiskey and the amazing history that it has is more wrapped up in the 19th century than it is in the 18th. And so when we want to talk about the excellence of Pennsylvania rye, I wanted to focus more on that 3-chamber. And I'm afraid that my mentioning that maybe once in the conversation is where they went with it. But I was like, look, you're already wrong about wanting to use Rosen in a conversation about the Whiskey Rebellion, because Rosen Rye wasn't even around until the early 1900s. It was a more modern industrial use rye. And I said, if you want something that's going to be, branching further back, it's going to be more of a landrace varietal, or it's going to be something that's maybe a white rye, but a different thing. So they didn't quite know what to do with me on that. They're like, oh, we'll make it work. So, then I was like, well, I would really like to get Erik involved from Stoll Wolfe, because I'd like the conversation to be more about Michter's, because that was the company that embraced Rosen. And if we're going to talk about Rosen, let's talk about that. And, understandably, Erik was like, no, thank you. Totally understandable. But the perspective that I was looking at it for is to help Bob, because I was like, look, this is the show is called Moonshiners. I don't have anything to do with moonshiners. My interest is in, the history of Pennsylvania rye whiskey. And that's basically post-Civil War, really. I mean, when you're talking about the larger distilleries, and the ones I'm writing about and researching anyway, are from that era. But I'm like, look, if it's moonshiners, then let's talk about the grain, and let's talk about the farmer, who I think is the most important person here. And then I said, well, let's make sure we get a mill involved. And in my opinion, that's the best scene in the whole show, is them at that mill grinding the grain. By the way, they did not use Rosen. There's no Rosen used in the making of this film. Here. Yeah, Bob, you want to speak to that?
The only time that we actually used the Rosen was in the seed vault, when I brought it out of the cooler,
right,
and showed it to them. That was the only time Rosen was actually involved.
Right.
Everything else was Danko.
That's great.
Right.
Did you know that, or did they think they were getting Rosen?
They knew it, because I told them from the get-go, because they were like, well, there was a lot of misunderstanding. They didn't understand grain, and nobody does. I mean, it's not really the fault of people on TV. That people in general don't understand grain. So they came to film in September. June. No, You're right. I'm sorry. June initially. And there was obviously a stand of Rosen that they could film. And then they said, we want to come back in September and film some pickup shots. And we'll get some of the rye. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's been long harvested. There's no rye. And they were like, well, oh no, what are we going to do? Is there any green rye left? I was like, that's not how plants work. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it was.
In my head, I'm just going to tell you right now, I have like this fantasy that you looked at them and that you did have Rosen, but what you did in my head, no matter what you say from here forward, I just won't listen. In my head, you looked at them and you were like, listen, I know you want Rosen Rye, but I refuse to play into your live action role playing game. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you prop rye, and you're going to do with it what you need to do to convince yourself that it's Rosen Rye.
That's actually what we did. I said, if you want rye, we can give you something that'll look like it. I was like, it's not going to be the right color, but nobody's going to know the difference. I was like, because Rosen has this beautiful kind of biscuit color to it, and a consistency of color throughout. Whereas, the non-variety stated that the NVS has like a greenish hue to it a lot of the time, or it'll be kind of a mixed batch. You never know what you're going to get. The Danko's a little bit browner, which is nice, but who's going to know? Me and what? Like us here. Everybody else is just going to go, oh yeah, rye, sure. We could have put barley in the picture and people would have been like, oh sure, rye. So that
mill scene, honestly, I agree with you. That was a cool scene. The mill scene was.
It wasn't it though? So amazing. And I think, and I can't even imagine what that poor miller had to do to get that thing going. Did you see the state of the mill race? Like, it's obviously not something they run very often. So he probably started that thing up and took hours to get it all set up and going, just to get those shots, to get the stone going and everything, and to get the water flowing and everything. I was just like, that. Give that guy a medal.
Right.
He put that all together for that one shot. But it was really impressive and it looked good on camera. So
I'm nosing and tasting this 2-year Rosen Rye right now, by the way. So there is obviously there's a biscuity character there, but I also get like a lot of like honeyed graham cracker on the nose, a ton of it that I really, really like. And I think that kind of brings it to the next point here. which is kind of, and anybody else has any tasting notes or nosing notes as well, I'm really enjoying it. But I think that that could bring us to the next point of like getting into the history of Rosen Rye kind of quickly, because we've done that before, but then going from that to Bob growing it, and, you know, how he makes that available, what he does on his farm, and then Erik distilling it. So, and then whether or not Todd plans to also do some Rosen.
I hope so.
Christy, do you have any tasting notes?
Yeah, like you were talking about getting that like honey cereal type note. I'm getting more of a ginger snap on the nose.
Ginger as well. Yeah.
It's crazy fruity. And that's the thing.
It
I
is.
think one of the tasting notes that so many people take away from rye is I think more to do with the Kentucky style rye and the fact that it's usually the non-variety stated that they're using. But a lot of people always talk about the spice characteristic. It's so spicy, it's adding spice. And yes, I agree there is spice. But I find that these heritage grains contribute so much more fruit and floral quality than, you know, the standard run-of-the-mill stuff that you're getting. I call it hamburger rye because it's basically just a mixed batch of you never know what the hell it is. But when you're looking at one specific varietal, and you know the Abruzzi obviously has its own characteristic. And if you go and look at what Mike Swanson has done with his rye study, looking at the different flavor characteristics that those different varietals contribute, I mean, the tasting notes are differing on all of them. So to see what the Rosen tastes like in that 3-chamber, I mean, that's because obviously what Erik has done is, you know, blown the socks off of this thing.
Well,
On the palate, there's a ton of floral going on the palate. Quite a bit of it. Similar to like Christy, whenever we distilled the honeysuckle that time, I get a lot of that on the back of the palate, and then on the fruit side of things. So I'm not getting like the standard stone fruit off of it on the nose. I'm getting more like almost like a star fruit or a little like tropical kind of thing going on the nose, which is pretty interesting.
I was getting a little bit of the floral that Laura was talking about, but there's a touch of a lemon peel in there. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying right there if you put those notes together. And there's a little bit of almost that resiny note back again too.
Yeah. Great job.
The complexity of it is it's intense, wonderful whiskey. Thank goodness. I mean, one of my fears of having this rye be distilled for the first time was I'm going to give it to somebody who's not going to do it justice. And so knowing that the master, Dick Stoll, and Erik were going to be the ones distilling it, totally set my mind at ease. And I was like, oh, thank God. At least when we try it for the first time, we'll have a reasonable idea of what this is supposed to taste like, because the man himself was sitting there distilling it. So yeah, we could not have dreamed up a better set of circumstances to make this first whiskey.
And that body on it.
Oh, sorry, Christy.
But I was just saying the body on it is so silky. It just coats your mouth.
Cheers.
Well, that's Erik.
a little about the time period that Rosen is from, right? The distillers that would have been using Rosen. And then getting those seeds into Bob's hands and then ultimately Erik's hands on the distilling side of things as well. So that way that fills in a little bit more of that history of what you were talking about, you know, straightening out the timeline of what happened on the show versus real life.
Sure. So initially the grain was brought over by a guy named Rosen. He was a Russian immigrant who was actually studying at the University of Michigan. And he started doing work with rye, and the school actually asked him to go back home and get some of the rye that his father was growing, which is the Rosen. So he brings it back and they start growing it and studying it and basically giving it to other people to grow it. But the initial batch of it, I guess everything was going well, but then after about 5 or 6 seasons, so we're into now like 1912, the grain started to lose its characteristics that people liked about it in the first place. And that's because it was cross-pollinating with other stands of rye that people were growing in Michigan, and or not necessarily in Michigan. It was being grown, you know, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, I'm sure, Indiana. farmers everywhere were grabbing it because they had already been growing this Egyptian white rye, which they knew they loved. And this was a new kind of more modern iteration of that. So they really wanted to get their hands on it. So it was being grown, you know, pretty on a massive scale, but there were a lot of other ryes being grown at the same time, which were crossing with it. Then when they found that it wasn't holding up and not maintaining its characteristics, they did this, the Manitou Island thing, that isolation of it on the island up in Canada. So they basically said, there's this family that we know that is willing to grow it for us and keep it for seed stock. And so they isolated it on that island, and that island became the source of seed stock for the rest of the growers throughout the Northeast and, you know, central states. They were obviously still growing it in Michigan, but it was not, you know, just Manitou Island supplying Rosen to everybody. You know, there were, God, I can't even fathom the numbers of pounds that they were using to make rye at the time. This is the early 1900s. These distilleries were cranking out, you know, hundreds of distilleries were making 100 barrels a day. Like, this is, well, maybe not hundreds, but 50 at least were making that much. And the ones in your neck of the woods in Ohio and Indiana were cranking out way more than that. So lots of rye was being used, lots and lots. Rosen became pretty ubiquitous in the right before Prohibition, but of course Prohibition banged that all up because, you know, the minute that came around, you know, nobody was, well, not, it didn't happen immediately, obviously, it happened over time, but rye became much less popular because, you know, another thing that people don't seem to understand is that, you know, it wasn't like people were growing rye because they were making a lot of rye bread and they had so much rye left over that they made whiskey out of it. Rye was grown for whiskey. Pennsylvania was the largest source of rye in the country. It was like the breadbasket for rye, and they were growing tonnage of it, but it was all being used for whiskey. It wasn't like, you know, people were eating tons of rye bread. That's what wheat was for. That's why Pennsylvania is not famous for wheat bread or for wheat whiskey. We're famous for rye whiskey because that's what all the rye was used for. Anyway, that being said, the more modern iterations of Rosen Rye that we're familiar with, obviously, were mixtures in Pennsylvania. And that's where Erik and Dick Stoll came in because, you know, Erik and his genius sought him out and formed a partnership with him in a distillery. And in 2016 is when I launched the Seed Spark project. And, you know, sitting in Erik's living room, basically, when I was traveling across the state, trying to find out, you know, what kind of grain are people growing and what are we using in our whiskey and who's sourcing from who. And I'm taking all these notes. And, you know, Erik and Dick Stoll just happened to mention that they would have loved to have had their hands on some Rosen. And of course, I had heard of it before, but this was the first time that the thought occurred to me, like, this is where my Seed Spark project could go. This is something, obviously, we know that Pennsylvania was famous for. This grain was obviously spectacular. We know it was because it was used in their advertising. Michter's put it on the side of their jugs. And so that was the first time I went looking for it. I found that Greg Roth over at Penn State had literally like half a baggie of it. He had like this much of it. And the minute that I heard that, I ran to him and was like, what are you doing with this seed? And he goes, well, we're not doing anything with it. I was like, what are you doing? What? He's like, well, we have it, but, you know, there's no, we don't have plans to move forward with it because we don't know what the future holds. I don't know. He basically just said, we're not growing any more of it. So that's when I said, well, what do you need to keep growing it? And he told me, so I cut him a check. I said, let's keep this going. Let's make this a part of the Seed Spark project moving forward. And we worked together for about 3 years propagating the rye at Penn State on their campus. And then Greg Roth retired, and the gentleman that followed him, Mark Antle, not necessarily in the same role as him, but he was the guy I worked with at Penn State. He retired. So then I was like, and so Bob and I, who had been hooked up through the American Whiskey Convention and who had been friends, and I already knew after talking with him that his property was isolated, a la Manitou Island. I was like, look, if we can grow it with you, knowing you know all your neighbors and you know that you're not going to have any cross-pollination going on up here, would you mind being seed stock location, primary location for this rye going forward? And Bob gave me the thumbs up, and that was all I needed to hear. So we moved the project to Bob's, and then proceeded to find other farms that were willing to do the same. So, you know, and Bob's a great advocate for this. So he got to talk to his friends, and, you know, we got a couple other people on board, a couple other distilleries that were willing to distill it other than Erik and Dick. And they distilled their first batch 2019, Erik?
Yep.
2019, September 7th, 2019 was the first run ever done of Rosen Rye, 50 years after the last time that Dick Stoll had run it. And now we've got he has a 2-year-old, and Bob is the source of seed stock. And now we've got 4 farms in Pennsylvania growing it. Obviously, this is still a research project, mind you. I mean, we're still keeping a very close eye on this grain. Erik's family, the Klein family farm, which is a century farm, deeded to them by William Penn. Like, talk about little historic, you know, attachment there. Amazing farm, amazing people, the Kleins. And they grew 2 acres last year. Erik just finished distilling that. Am I right?
Yep.
And then we have it also growing up in Lake Erie area, because I want to see what that micro climate up there might do to the grain. We have it growing on hollowed ground at Gettysburg. So Gettysburg State Park has some of it in the ground. And they did some crimping on their land. So we're looking at different farming techniques there. And then we've got it obviously at Bob's house, Bob's farm, Dancing Star Farms. And there's the other location. I think that's it this year. In the past, we had it at Penn State, but we haven't grown it this year. And I think I'm caught up.
Yes.
Okay.
So Bob, I think that kind of brings us to you on this thing too. So tell us a little bit about Dancing Star Farms. And that was one of the things I was excited to see, because you, like me, you talk to a lot of distillers and home distillers. So you and I have a lot of very similar, if not the same, friends in the world. So seeing you on the show was excellent as well. But and I don't think that until the show, I don't think there were a lot of people that knew that you were out there as a resource, for example. So talk a little bit about what you do at the farm and what you're growing and what's out there, just so that people know, because it's not just Rosen Rye, but you're playing around with a lot of different corn varieties as well, and a lot of neat stuff that I think anybody that watched that show and listens to this show, they're going to be interested in what you have. So, and
I will say, if you look at Bob's Instagram, it is like grain porn.
It's
just gorgeous to look
so
at.
Awesome.
I get yelled at all the time by my wife. What are you doing on your phone? I've probably grown 12 or 13 different varieties of corn. I'm growing Bloody Butcher, Jimmy Red. Now, there's a whole discussion right there. What's the difference between Bloody Butcher and Jimmy Red? I think it is all from what area you're coming from and who you're talking to. It's just, they called it a different thing because, you know, I'm growing both of them and they look identical. So I think it's just, you know, like that Southern you get that Southern accent involved. You know, they're calling it Jimmy Red because it's from the South. You know, up north it's Bloody Butcher. You know, I'm growing Ohio Blue, Amanda Palmer, which I think everybody knows about Amanda Palmer, right, Alan?
I think so at this point. I had to find my microphone. Sorry. I said, I think so at this point. I had to find my microphone button. It escaped me.
I'm growing an Argentinian Orange Creole.
Oh.
Probably about 6 or 8 different varieties of yellow corn. You know, a lot of that goes for farmers for animal feed, but you know.
Are you still doing the Wapsie Valley, Bob?
Yeah, I'm doing Wapsie Valley, doing Minnesota 13. that was a big time thing up in Minnesota back during Prohibition. There's they did a documentary on that a couple years ago about using Minnesota 13 and how the church was actually involved in it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually for anybody listening, that's actually an excellent documentary that public television did up in
Yeah.
Minnesota a few years ago. And it's a good example of like exactly what you guys are doing, right? They talk to a distillery that is using Minnesota 13 now and bringing it back to the forefront. They talk about some of the history of moonshining, the development of Minnesota 13, where it came from public breeding programs, trying to bring it back to the forefront. And as Bob said about, the Catholic Church sort of backing up the moonshiners up there, which is a story that you'll find. And we have the same thing in Du Bois County, Jasper area. It was very, very similar, but it's definitely worth checking out.
I'm also working with a purple hulless barley. I don't know where that's going to go yet, but my kind of theory is, if I grow it, somebody's going to want it.
Yeah, I can tell you right now that I can get that to more than a few distillers that are trying to figure out how to distill hammer milled single malt.
Yeah.
So in a pot still, without no loudering, and if you don't have any hulls, I'm pretty confident I can make a couple phone calls and get rid of your harvest. So keep that in mind.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like you have much problem finding customers these days.
No.
Again, this is where the Moonshiner show came in handy. Just throw that back in the
You wouldn't
conversation.
believe how many calls I've gotten since that show was aired.
Oh,
Can I get just one bag of Rosen Rye?
See, but that's a win. That's
Right.
So there's a nice positive that came out of the show. That's great.
That was the whole point.
Yeah.
First, that's it. That's the beginning and end of it. I just said all I want to do is make sure that Bob ends up profiting from this and ends up, getting the word out. And if they didn't say Rosen 50 times, that made me happy. Just keep saying that word over and over again. People will get it into their heads that there are different ryes out there other than just rye. It's not just corn. It's, this is one of those things that, in the future, all the distilleries everybody's using Bloody Butcher now. Why? When there's, thousands of varieties of corn out there and hundreds of there's so much to do and so many different grains to try. And it's kind of like, come on, distill it. Yeah, sorry. That's
we all went straight to the cat.
Your new
Bob,
your
I had
customers. Does anybody with all your new customers? With all your new customers, does anybody ask you to sign a bag yet?
That's coming. That's coming.
Yeah.
That's coming. I promise you.
Right.
Bob, I had a question real quick. Did you have? Were there any issues with growing? Or anything notable with growing the whole soup to nuts of getting the rye in and out of the ground? Was there anything notable?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first year, both years, it grew about 6.5 foot tall.
Oh.
The first year, it stood very well, and it was a nightmare to harvest. It wrapped on the combine auger going into the head. Then the second year, we had a storm. I'd say it was probably beginning of June after it was in heads. And that's, it was flat on the ground.
Yeah. We had that with the birdseed.
It went from 6 feet to 1 foot. Basically overnight.
Oh, we do the Abruzzi rye. And we had no problems the first year. I farmed it. Shut up, Todd. Our farmer didn't have any problems the first year. It's about 4 feet tall out here. We're in the farm is at elevation, so it's at 8,000 feet, very dry.
Yeah.
but he sent me on a Friday night into a panic attack of, we had a late frost in Colorado, and you got the moisture at the top, it all lodged. I looked at it, and my brother and I were spending the weekend trying to switch from putting doing rye. We do 80% rye, 20% malted barley for our whiskey, to going 100% malt. And he sent me a text on Monday, and 80% of it went right back up. God bless Turgor for us, right? But so that's why I was curious. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Actually, the second year that I had it, this past year, when it went down, it was actually easier to get through the combine.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because it wasn't real tall, and I could get underneath it, and it fed right into the combine. I had less trouble harvesting it when it went down.
Close enough to harvest. One thing I want to make a point about too is, what the farming aspect of it. And Bob, I know you can speak to this obviously, but I just want to bring it up. The combine situation. Now, when we were growing in Pennsylvania, when the state of Pennsylvania was growing Rosen Rye, and this is something I'm working on with Mike Swanson too, because he's growing Rosen up in Minnesota, so we can look at the differences of growing conditions and growing styles. Like down here, we can't swath. Swathing just means, for all your listeners, is basically when you cut it down in the field and let it lie there to dry. So you can bring it down to the moisture content you want before you harvest it. We can't do that in Pennsylvania because we get late summer rains, and that would just rot our crop. It would just sit, go straight to hell. So up there, they can do that. They'll have 2 weeks of dry weather, and it doesn't sit there for 2 weeks, but 5 to 7 days of dry weather. That's great. But back in the day in Pennsylvania, we had different combines. So the combine would cut down the stalk and feed the heads and the whole stalk into the machine, and then up a conveyor. Now it's augers, and it's a totally different machine. So that straw is something the machine's not built to deal with. The machines now are built to deal with wheat. And so when you have a 6 foot tall, thick stalk grain, the old combines could handle that. They were like, yeah, no problem. Chop, chop, chop. Here you go. Send it back. Now you got this beautiful straw that you can send to your, send as a second crop, actually, value added way for the farmer to make a second cash crop off of it, sell it as straw. But instead of grinding it up and making poor Bob have to go 2 miles an hour, you could kind of whip through your crop, where now he's getting it stuck in the, you talk about it. It's your combine.
It wrapped on the auger going into, before it actually got into the combine. See, the old combines, it had the cutter bar, and it's like you said, it had a conveyor. It had a draper cloth.
Right.
It was a canvas belt with little wooden sticks on it that actually pulled it up, and it didn't wrap.
Yeah,
so.
We've got those machines out this way, both for oats. If you ever heard the San Luis Valley, which is on the southwestern portion of the state, that's really an elevation. That's over 10,000 feet, and they swath there. And the problem with swathing from a distiller's perspective is for every 50,000 pound silo of that stuff that we probably get 20, 30 pounds of rock. The amount of stones that you get, if you are not careful. We run that when we know if we're getting some from the San Luis Valley barley in particular, we are running that de-stoner nice and slow. We go at about half the rate that we would for the front range stuff, because I don't want to blow up. So you get that spark in that hammer mill, and you've got all kinds of problems. But this is part of the stuff that I find neat of, we're down to reinventing the wheel. And until you start doing these things and understanding how it behaves, we just malted some Abruzzi rye, by the way. And for those that don't know, we floor malt, and we've got a conical steep that we put wheelbarrows underneath that holds 22,000 pounds of dry grain into it for a steep. It usually takes us 2 hours to pitch the floor. With the Abruzzi, it's so oily and sticky. It took us 12 hours to completely empty the steep tank to get that stuff out. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, we didn't have that issue. We've done conventional rye before. We didn't have that much of an issue, but the oil content's so high and the starch is so low. You're basically reaching into a 20-foot tall tank trying to knock everything down. It was a very long day. But the one last question, and then I'm going to stop interrupting. What do you know what the starch content of the Rosen was, or that you're getting? Is there an average? Does anybody know?
I have the information. I don't have it with me. I didn't think
Just
that question would come up.
curious.
But the thing is that, and you know this from your Abruzzi, that the protein content is much higher. So
Yeah.
it's funny because when we first started doing tests on the grain, and this is something that maybe you can help answer too, Todd, is like the testing that we're doing on the grain is done for maltsters and for beer guys. So the testing all comes back with, a negative that there's high protein. I don't see that as a negative. You obviously don't see that as a negative.
Right.
Then they also talk about
Plumpness was the other one, Laura, that they
Well,
said
yeah.
as plump
Yeah.
but it's comparing it to barley, not other
right.
rye.
Nobody knows rye. Nobody cares about rye until
Yeah.
now, where we're starting to care about it again. And so I'm talking to the folks down at Wilderness Trail going like, well, what do you guys think I should be doing to do testing for distillers like yourself, people that want to use these grains? Is there something that distillers are looking for that brewers are not? And those answers are vast and varied, like what do you guys want? What are you looking for in the grain? How do I, as a person who gives, all of her attention to grain, help the distillers recognize what it is that they want in their product? So it's one thing to say like, this is your protein content, my starch content, well, okay, so how does it behave when it's fermenting? What kind of percentages do you need? How much grain do you need to get your bricks content where you need it? Do you notice it? Like all the
Right.
things that you guys need to know. What do I need to put on the label?
If you have a, Alan, go ahead. Were you starting in on that?
No, I was just agreeing. I was also gonna to say two things, and I'll let you go back to that conversation. First, Pat Heiss shows up in every distiller's talk somewhere. He's like the hidden
I know.
character
He's awesome.
in a video
Where's
game.
Waldo?
I could listen to him
Yeah.
talk, by the way, all day. Like he could read a book to me. I would listen to it.
And the
His
second
birthday,
thing is, and I'll let Todd answer this after he gets back to your question. But the chances of Todd malting Rosen Rye for part of this conversation in the future.
I'd be delighted to do both. It's an easy thing for us to do. The issue for us, and I never thought I'd say this in the history of my company, we just need quite a bit of it from our perspective. I can tell you that the things that I looked at when we were searching for rye, and the nice thing, Laura, hearing you talk about all these things, it's fun for me to find that my research didn't suck into the 3-chamber still. And we're finding the same things, and that Rosen was mentioned in Pennsylvania. I came onto it a lot more down in Maryland, in particular, kept coming up in Maryland agricultural publications talking about that. What I look at is starch, and if those of you who suffered through the video on 3-chamber know why. So having less starch, the math going from 60% starch to modern, which these days, I think the Antero wheat that came out of CSU here in Colorado is like 83% starch. What that means is that we're adding, to make that 5% beer, you're adding 20% more, 20 to 30% more of the grain for the same amount of alcohol. And it's the same reason I don't like adding enzymes. Enzymes break down compounds, beta glucans, and other things into fermentable sugars, which is great if you're trying for yield. But, I'm not Pat Heiss putting down 1,000 barrels every 10 minutes. I'm exaggerating, but I'm looking for flavor. I don't want that yield. And the more you increase that yield out of that rye that you're adding into it, the more you're diluting the flavor. And it may, 20%'s a lot, 30%'s a lot when you're talking about, we're talking about the human palate and what you prefer and what you don't prefer. That really is a big difference. So starch is the first thing. When I see low starch, I'm happy. I'm probably the only one out there. I've learned that well, Alan and others, that's an exaggeration, but the other thing that I look for is ferulic acid. Ferulic acid, the building block for 4-vinyl guaiacol. That's something I learned very early on from making Hefeweizens and how to control that spicy note. It's helpful to know what it is. And then the other one would be linalool groupings, and linalool is that floral note that you guys were picking out of the rye that you're sampling now. Those are the three big things. The one thing I have learned is I've gotten more into research of grains, and the conversation you were having about sending it up to, did you say Penn State? Is that where the samples went, Laura?
No, we were sending ours to Hartwick College.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
But the relationship of stepping it up, starting from a handful of seeds and stepping it up. We've got Colorado State University up the road, and they're wheat specialists.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Were you talking about the samples to do the testing on?
The samples
to grow it?
To grow it.
To grow it, Penn State.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm not.
Yeah, no, you were right. I'm sorry.
completely.
I thought we were talking about testing.
Oh, that's okay. We're changing subjects rapidly. But we have that resource up at CSU, and they have the same kind of plots that you see, and are good enough to keep it separated, because it doesn't do any damn good to, wind up with what the hell happened to your rye samples. So they've been good enough to do that work for us. But the biggest thing that we're seeing more and more research, brewers are starting to step into it. And I'm a member of the American Society of Brewing Chemists, Master Brewers Association. So you're seeing more and more of these document dumps and research papers that are coming out where they show that variety is less important than where you grow it. Now, of course, a lot of these studies are on modern varieties of barley and things where they've already been bred to the bejesus already. But to me, I look at that and boy, am I fascinated, because it brings the regionality that we all love so much into play, that Indiana whiskey is going to taste different than Pennsylvania, and the Maryland's going to taste different. And
it also confirms some old things about seed too, some old assumptions that we've talked about on this show before, and even with you, Todd, that seed, even open pollinated seed, which has been, and landrace seed that's been adapted to a local place. The old saying about corn and the old varieties of corn is corn likes to go home. To what it's used to, right? What it knows. And I think all seeds are like that, right? So I agree with you. And it's going to be cool to see these little bioregions grow, even if they're only using modern cultivars. But that idea of true terroir and what really affects these, all things being equal, if it's modern cultivars, right? But what environment do you get the flavors that you want and the starches that you want and all those things? That's an interesting conversation that there's a lot of levity in.
I got to do a quick plug here, because I noticed Erik pulled up a book on landrace gardening from somebody that we've had on the show before, Joseph Lofthouse.
Awesome.
He's like Droopy Dog, where I go to open a cabinet that I think no one's opening, and I think I'm like pulling out this like dusky information, and it's like, well, now I wouldn't say that, and now I'm just there looking at me. So yes, I was reading this book and I was like, wow, this is so interesting, like great information. I'm like, Alan was already here. So to the book, really, really interesting information. And again, talking about what so much of you guys are talking about, where, and with some of the Rosen, it was so interesting, Todd, hearing you talk about reintroducing the 3-chamber, because so many folks look at what's happening with the Rosen and will ask us questions about its traits or yield or distilling with it. And I'm always really honest that we don't quite know yet. I mean, we're so early on in this, and we've only had a few growing seasons and harvests with it, that I can't tell you if those have been 2 or 3 of the best years for growing Rosen in the last 50, or maybe the worst. So it's such a, it's scary sometimes, just in that with such a small sample size, you want to do it justice, but it's sometimes hard with, again, just so few data points.
But here's where, Erik, you're sitting pretty, because with Rosen specifically, we know it was grown in Pennsylvania. We know that Michter's was sourcing from local farms. Your family is local, nothing more local
we haven't gotten very far.
Well, you're right next to Michter's, really. So that land is the same kind of soil. Well, not same, but similar. And Alan's saying grain likes to go home. Welcome home, right? And so
Right.
the other thing too is, I mean, Rosen hasn't been grown in 50 years. So talk about a grain that wants to go home. It hasn't been acclimated to this modern soil content. The different ways that we're treating the soil and the different additives that we're adding. I mean, Bob and I were talking the other day about how this farmer we were talking to in his 80s, and he's given up on growing heritage grains because all of his neighbors, he's like, nobody knows how to grow corn. Everybody's like terrible farmers around me. This man's in his 80s. He's like, they're all doing it wrong. They're all using chemicals. They're all ruining it. And the damn deer only want to eat my land. So all the animals come to his property and eat all his. He's like, I gotta beat them off with a stick. He's like, it's not worth it. And he's like, and the way that you treat the soil is the way that the soil, like you treat the soil the way that it deserves to be treated. He used to break rocks off of the cliff face on his property because that was limestone. And he ground the limestone in his grinder on his property and scattered it on his soil as the treatment for his soil, so that he could bring the pH to where he needed it to be. But what's in that rock? All of those minerals, all of that. It's not just taking a bag of lime and scattering it on your property. It's not just taking a chemical and dump. It's the land wanting to be the land, using the land to treat it. It's funny because, all these things that we're talking about, this respect for history, the memory is lost. Prohibition destroyed all this. And so we're not reinventing the wheel in the way that, I know that's what you said, Todd, but it's almost like we're trying to rediscover how to build it in the first place. Like they knew how to do it. Pennsylvania had 250 years of experience with rye. If they chose Rosen, they chose it for a pretty damn good reason, because they've been working with rye for 250 years. And this one's the best one that they've had so far. So, yes, we are kind of walking in the dark here, but the work was done for us in the early 1900s. We just need to figure out how to bring ourselves back to a place where we have more respect for the way that they used to do things, and stop treating the old way as this, like, the rickety old way that now we all know better how to do it. It's like, do we? We seem to have banged it up quite a bit. It's nice to be able to go back and look at the 3-chamber, because 250 years led to that, and that 3-chamber brought out the best in whiskey, and they knew it. And that's why Hiram Walker was still using that still when everybody else, when they wanted to do it cheaper, they did the column stills. And I don't think that looking back at the past is a bad thing. Let's just put it that way.
So
And
two
I'll stop
things
there,
real
sorry.
quick, and then I want to go to Erik on his experience with distilling Rosen, so that we can start bringing this thing back around. But I just want to point out that, Laura, that was the best sequel to my Facebook rant from anybody. You finished it on here. That's exactly how you do those things. The second thing is, because we've mentioned Pat's name like 3 times, and if in case Pat tunes into this episode and just skims through it, like I think he probably does sometimes. Not that you go back and listen to the whole thing, Pat, but somewhere in there, I'm pretty sure I heard Todd Leopold say that Megadeth was at least 20 to 30% better than Slayer. So with that being said, Erik, I'd love to hear you talk about distilling the Rosen a little bit. And I'm particularly curious with Dick Stoll, and I know a lot of people have already asked you those kind of questions, but I'm very curious about when you got this Rosen for the first time and you're distilling it. All right, and Dick is there with you, right? Correct. At the time, was he right there on you the whole time, or did he back off and let you kind of feel your way through some?
So Dick was the most supportive mentor I could have ever hoped to have. He never said a negative thing to me once, and I think, I don't know, I just know as a parent, sometimes when you're under pressure, you snap a little bit. You maybe say things, or you're not as nurturing as you'd like to think that you are in the grand scheme of things, just because you're under pressure. Well, with Dick, knowing that he was a mortal person, I mean, passing away was the first human thing I really saw him do, but he knew that would happen someday. So knowing that he had so much to impart and a finite amount of time to do it, he never once made me feel like I was under pressure to do so. I personally would come home and my wife would hear me, freaking out about not, excuse my language, fucking up this opportunity. But it was the kind of thing where when you put your existence on the line to help preserve something because you believe in it so much, the last thing you want to do is be its destruction or its downfall. So for us, that second of the distillate coming off the still and me handing Dick the hydrometer flask to sip from was the longest. Like, my life is flashing before my eyes the whole time. And then seeing him smile and nod in approval was just, this is the only whiskey I've ever cried while proofing. Now I'm somewhat new to the industry, so hopefully that won't happen again, but just that Dick wasn't there to taste it was just so moving to me. And it was one of those things that just to be a part of something so much larger, again, we're so fortunate that Laura and the folks at Penn State and Bob and everybody worked so hard. And then we were sort of at the end of the relay, crossing the finish line. So we got credit for it, but it was only because everyone else had done so much to enable us to get there. But for us, it's hard when someone asked us, what's it like to be a part of a whiskey history, where I can't even answer that. If I did, I wouldn't be the person I don't think that Dick would have wanted to work with. Just, he was of the mind that you just do what you do. Everyone asked him when he distilled A.H. Hirsch what the secret was with that. And he would always laugh that it was their regular whiskey. It was just aged a little bit longer. And there was only one batch of whiskey he ever regretted in his life, which was a moldy batch at the very, very end of Pennsylvania Michter's. They made him take out of the silo and run. And he was actually in the Korean War. And he said that batch was for export. He's like, I was in a war. Those people, were our sworn enemies. I still didn't want to send that whiskey over for export just because, again, people knew I made it. So I think for us, it was just something we were wholly unprepared for emotionally to experience it and still sort of processing. But just to be able to return Dick to distilling and enable him to work with Rosen Rye again, for us was just, other than getting married and having my daughter, that's up there of top days of my life for sure. Sorry, it's one of those things where even to speak about, sometimes you just get it's almost just hard to process in a way, if that makes sense.
It does.
No, that was perfect, and that makes a ton of sense. And that's something we definitely appreciate. That's what we want. We want passionate distillers who care about what they're doing and put that kind of thought and effort into it. At least I do, right? I mean, same thing with whatever musicians you like or whatever artists you like. You want them to be passionate and care about what they're doing. And that shows that you do. And so I know that this has been a real milestone for you to get this product out there. And so just from the hearing that beautiful interpretation of what you went through there, but also, I think that there's something poetic about the way that Rosen Rye tastes that goes along with that too, right? There's something distinctly, as we talked about earlier, there's, these different bioregions and bringing that diversity back and stuff like that. To me, no matter where a Rosen Rye distillate comes from, that's what I'm always going to think of now as you guys doing Rosen Rye in Pennsylvania, right? I may not even be thinking of the ones, from back in the big industrial days. I'm going to be thinking of you guys having made it, and you with Dick Stoll in particular, and Bob having grown it, and Laura having, helped reintroduce it, and that whole thing. That's the story that's going to stick with me, that becomes a sentimental piece of the entire history and story of that whiskey and how it ties to the local people, the local place, the local culture, and their connections to it. So And I'm curious when you were distilling this. So when you first actually tasted this whiskey off the still, right? Do you have any memories that are kind of lingering of what you tasted coming off that still as a new make?
So I have to give Lisa Wicker credit. She was there with us as was Steve Bayshore from Mount Vernon, and Lisa, to my mind, said it better than I ever could have. She said it tasted like rye someone had rolled around in sugar. The new make, which for us was pretty high praise. It was interesting too because we did distill this within the first 6 months of actually starting to run our still with Dick. So as you guys know, anytime you're running a system, you're working out kinks and you're trying to figure out the gremlins in the system and what you could do better. Except we had pressed there, standing all around as we're working on this stuff. And it's one of those things where, you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing, and you don't want to look like you don't want to give away that there's anything that maybe slightly you're still figuring out. But for us, the fact that we were still working out a few things in the still, I'd lie if I didn't say that we are still working out things with the still, but it was, there were definitely moments where we were asking ourselves, why did we agree to allow press in here while we were doing this? Because trying to run this still while you have people standing everywhere and there's all kinds of things happening and you're reaching over people to throw valves. So for us, we were sort of too dumb to know any better, which was great. And Dick was the least, he could never understand that anyone was even interested in what he did. He understood that people liked the whiskey, but when he was distilling, he referred to it as the plant, and not because it was he was making widgets. I mean, he cared so deeply about what he did, but he was just a guy who was working for a brand that he cared about so much and loved, but he didn't think that anybody cared who the master distiller was or that they would want to meet him. Or we were down in Kentucky at Four Roses, and Jim Rutledge was in the gift shop signing bottles, and we were saying to Dick, well, let's go say hi. And Dick's like, he's busy, I don't want to bother him. And when we told Jim the story later, he was like, what do you mean he didn't come over and say hi? But again, Dick was just so humble that the fact that Jim Rutledge would have wanted to talk to him didn't even occur to him and seemed preposterous to him. I mean, the first person that ever asked him to sign a bottle of the Hirsch, he looked at my dad thinking that the person had put him up to it, that it was almost like a joke of some kind. I mean, he really just could never, I think, again, I always tell people he was so old school, they just called it school. There wasn't old, new, there was just the way you did things, and that's how he did it. I mean, he was missing part of a finger, part of his middle finger actually, from when he worked in the barrel crew and they were loading barrels, and it ripped off part of his finger. So, in a modern workplace where we are all justifiably concerned about safety, I was just asking him what it was like, and he was like, well, I went home for the afternoon and I think I had like a day or two off, and he's like, I don't know, they were very nice to me about it. I was like, well, did they give you any extra money, or did they? He's like, no, I don't think so. But that was just the kind of guy he was. I mean, you literally put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. And again, that's just what you did. So for him, man, I don't know. I miss him so much. We always say that anytime, if Dick were here now and heard me talking about him like this, his response would be, get the hell back to work. What are you doing talking about me? You have whiskey to make. What's going on here? So for me, the best thing is that when I miss him as much as I do, producing whiskey using the system he designed and the things that he taught me, and I can't think of a better way to sort of honor his legacy and celebrate him. So, and again, he would laugh and tell me to, shut up and stop being so sappy. But I can honestly say the only thing we ever disagreed on ever is I'm an Eagles fan, which is a sickness. I can't help it. And he was a Dallas fan.
Oh,
That was
no.
the only irreconcilable difference we've ever had in our relationship, thankfully.
Well,
So.
well, at least now we know that Mr. Stoll can be wrong, so that's good.
The saint.
I was like, there you go. So, but really just an amazing guy. I mean, he got the job there. I asked him how he set out to become a master distiller, and again, he just laughed. And he got out of the Korean War and was working on essentially the forerunner of jets when he was there. And they paid him an extra $25 a month because he agreed to go up in the jets after he fixed them. Such a calm guy that one of the pilots that he was up with did, I think it was 3 or 4 passes on the aircraft carrier. And Dick was like, no, you got this, you can do it. The guy missed, they ended up in the water, didn't even get their feet wet because they stood on the wing, and Dick went up with him the next week. And was just like, I felt like he needed the confidence boost. He was okay. So again, in retrospect, me telling that story, I guess anything I put him through was probably not nearly as stressful as that. But again, came out of the Korean War, went to the unemployment office. They told him they were looking for people to dig a ditch. So he showed up to help dig a ditch. It ended up being the foundation for the expansion of what was the Bomberger distillery that was Penco that they were then expanding. The foreman said, hey, you were the only guy that showed up every day and you didn't drink while you were here. Do you want to work in this building that you just helped dig the foundation for? Worked his way up through the barrel crew, maintenance. Ultimately, Charlie Bean said to him, hey, you're the only guy that shows up every day and you don't drink on the job. Apparently drinking on the job was a big problem back then. So he started to teach Dick to distill. And again, classic Dick Stoll. Dick went in and tried to resign as the head distiller after Charlie Bean had gone back to Kentucky. And he said, I'm just ignoring my maintenance duties and I can't neglect those. Those are really important in a distillery. And they said, well, I think we can find someone to help you with those if you wouldn't mind running the stills, that'd be great. But he really just, no ego. He just wanted to do what needed to be done and what he felt like the distillery needed at the time, which was more help with maintenance. So again, I think that really did inform his whole outlook on everything, where when we were getting up and running and looking at some other stills and visiting other distilleries, we visited a distillery and happened to ask the gentleman what one of the pipes did. And he's like, well, I have this touch screen and I started over here and then distillate comes out at the end. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. But what does that pipe do? And he's like, well, no, but I have this pad that I press and distillate comes out at the end. And Dick would always use that as sort of an example where it's like, this is, if you want to say that you learned in my tradition, that's not the type of distiller you can be. You need to know all of it. I mean, we were joking, Todd, before you came on, that I was so excited that our boiler was so clean inside that to show the boiler inspector how clean our firing tubes were, where again, it's just such geekery. But if you know your boiler or mostly know your boiler and how it operates, it just, those are the fundamentals I think of distilling in so many ways. So again, just the technician aspect of the equipment and yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling at this point. But.
No, that's perfect. This is exactly why we wanted to do this panel for the show, was to again give a little bit more of that history and that background, and have people on that know that history and that background. Let you guys expand upon what happened on the show, what didn't happen on the show, and have Todd on to talk about the 3-chamber and that stuff as well. So I think this is kind of a good point here, Christy and you guys. I'd like to let you guys ask any questions of one another that didn't get asked, or cover any of those topics that maybe didn't get covered the way that you wanted them to, or bring up anything like that you do. But I want to leave it up to you guys as opposed to me trying to steer this towards an end, because I know that I'm going to get distracted and ask a question that probably has nothing to do with anything else that we talked about. So I think if you guys have questions that you want to ask each other as well, now's a great time for that.
And if I could just put a Bo, on the last part, that's for us why we ultimately didn't do the show. Not that we didn't think it was honoring certain traditions, but for us, just the nuance and just sort of the history and the individuals behind it. I know in television it's so much of a soundbite, or it's so rapid. So for us, that was sort of the reason. Again, just why it didn't make sense. But I'm so glad, Robert, that it's worked out well for you, and you've gotten so many new customers from it. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Erik, I wanted to ask you, the first Rosen that you distilled came from State College area.
It did.
And the second that you just distilled was grown locally down at your place. Can you taste the difference?
So that's a great question. I think you can taste a slight difference, but I don't know how much of that is from seasonal variation.
Yeah.
In it, I'd be curious. I have white of both. I'd love to be able to send them out so folks could try and see what they think as well.
So you're going to be getting some of mine here in a month or so. I'd like to see the comparison, of all three grown at different locations to see if there is a difference.
That would be really exciting. And Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the yields were amazingly similar. You got about 45 to 48 bushels an acre?
It came in right around 40.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm sorry.
And just to put just to say, like, as far as yields go, they were bragging in the early 1900s that Rosen yielded 33 bushel an acre, that was a big deal. So our modern mentality of commodity grain and what bushel an acre we're supposed to have is very warped. And, if you're thinking about, growing rye in large quantities, it was done. And they distilled Rosen, and these giant distilleries that were, processing monstrous amounts of rye were using this grain, which meant that farmers were growing huge amounts of it on huge amounts of land, utilizing that farmland, and it can be done again in a way that makes sense. It just needs to be understood as from a distiller's perspective. And maybe that's what my question is, that what do the distillers need to begin to understand in order to make what Bob is doing, maybe not more palatable to the local farmers around the distillers, but to make those relationships more feasible going forward across the board, not just, the people that I'm talking to, not just, your neighbor, but the folks in Colorado and Washington and New York and Texas and every other place that wants to get involved in this. I mean, what do distillers need to do going forward to help make that happen? To work with local farmers, to work with grain producers.
Well,
do you see any?
From my perspective, the biggest thing that everything is drifting towards, and we're of course talking about the smaller distillers, is that they want to grow local. The problem with that is grain doesn't grow everywhere, and it doesn't. The thing that we always, for about the questions finally slowed a little bit, but they would always ask, what are you distilling that's local? And, potatoes, peaches, when Alan said before that things, tend to find their way home. We have a specific area on the other side of the Eisenhower Tunnel where we get world-class peaches because it's a very wide temperature difference at night. That's why they're so beautiful. It's a very, very specific part. It's right along the Colorado River. You've got irrigation there that's 100 plus years old. It's pretty cool to see. The problem that ends up coming, it's trying to attract distillers that are trying to go local that shouldn't go local, that are in areas where rum distillers that aren't anywhere near sugarcane. That's where being able to differentiate your molasses and that sort of thing is helpful. A lot of it is a lot of the distillers aren't necessarily as dorky as those of us that are on the panel and don't necessarily think about that. It's what Alan and I call making alcohol. And what they have a tendency to do, I mean, every place they're free to run their plant the way that they want, but there's a tendency to gravitate towards the cheapest ingredients still.
Right.
That's still a thing. And from my perspective, and it took me a while to figure that out, that not everybody thinks the same way. I kept seeing distillers that would come up as like, why are you using this garbage, you know, or flavorings, or to me, it doesn't make any sense to do that. But there's everybody has a different target, and there's the top shelf and the bottom shelf and everywhere in between. And so to me, part of it is that there are so few distillers that either have the training or have the interest, which to me is kind of more important in many ways, to think about these things, to be able to look and see your ferulic acid levels, for instance, that, oh, that's what I want. And I'm willing to pay 30% more to get that. And I'm willing to pay a little bit more to get the store, to know who the farmer is. Right. So that's a tough question. And of course, the same thing happened to craft brewers or small, or what I call small brewers. They're pulling the same crap. We make our own floor malt here, and the vast majority of them are buying the cheapest base malt that they can possibly buy. But yet they're still charging. I can't even do pricing anymore. I can't keep up with it, but $20 for a 6-pack, when in reality it's industrial beer that really doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do with anything. You know what I mean? That there's no, so I'm certainly not saying that local isn't everything. To me, local is important. Quality is more important. And if you're able to distinguish and tell people, those quality ticks and market them a little bit, that's what I see as long-term viability. But as more and more, distillers are popping up in Pennsylvania, and maybe they'll finally get rid of your public, what's it called?
The
LTV.
state system.
Thank you. Maybe you guys are going to finally privatize, and that's going to kick the door down for, I think, a little bit of everything. Maybe this is I've been friends with Lou Bryson for a very long time, and I knew him from his beer writings way the hell back in the early 90s. And he's always, maybe this is the year, so this is a bit of the Charlie Brown Lucy with the football thing.
Right.
But
the problem is you don't have, like, we're talking local and everything. We're talking grain production, and say you are in Colorado, but next year we talked about you getting Rosen, right?
Mm-hmm,
you're going to be sourcing that Rosen from Pennsylvania, which ideally is what I would love to see happen, to have people from Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio and every place else. And they say, we know to get our grain from Pennsylvania because that's where it grows best. And we know that's where it is and where the most amount of it is. Yes, that's perfect going forward. I don't know. Do you want to chime in on this, Erik? Like what your situation is? Because your farmer specifically said that he's having his own issues with.
Well, and I think to answer your question, Laura, to maybe help answer it, of what distillers are looking for in grains, I think, to circle back to what Bob said about Bloody Butcher being so popular, I think as a small distiller, I was just saying this to my wife today as I was fixing barrels that had dried out, but we're doing things where in the big distillers, there's entire departments that are able to be devoted to it. So for us, I go pick up the apple cider at the Amish farmer's place. And again, he has a truck he can't drive because he's Amish. I don't have a pickup truck because my wife won't let me get one, but I can use his pickup truck to go get but again, for me to do that takes an hour out of my day that I don't already have. And it takes, so I think for so many distillers, and from the infrastructure side to deal with it, if they're used to 50-pound bags and it's super sacks, or it needs to be cleaned and screened slightly differently because it lodged, because it was a heritage grain, the whole way through to the marketing aspect of it, where I know with the Rosen, one of the things that is the biggest challenge for us, and we're so thankful to be able to work with a partner like you, is that for me to explain to people what Rosen is I have a very small megaphone and not a ton of time to yell through it, where sometimes I think with something like Bloody Butcher, because people know that Makers uses it, or because people have heard of it, or that it's identifiable, and because other people have sort of established that beachhead, it's almost easier for them to say, like if you're pitching a movie in Hollywood, well, it's Jaws, but with a dog. Oh, it's Cujo. Okay, people get that. Where I think with sometimes, sorry, a little bit of jumping around there, but that said, I think for some small distillers, it's easier to be like, hey, we use the corn Makers uses, and you know how their product quality is. So I think sometimes for the smaller guys, just the unknown aspect of it, of how they're going to get it from the farm to the distillery, they don't have a silo necessarily to put it in, or they don't with their smallest batch that they could work with may be different. So I think with a lot of them, it's almost a trust thing, and almost seeing other folks maybe work with it that may help, or seeing other case studies. I don't know if that's true.
Well, no,
but
that's really one of the things that we've been trying to do is, you obviously, I knew you guys were not going to bang it up. It was always going to be in good hands coming out of your distillery first. Then to try some of the smaller distilleries with very different production facilities. Obviously, Liberty Pole, they should have theirs is going to be 2 years old this September, I believe, but they're not going to release it till it's 3 years old. So that's another year from now. But then, to have Todd get his hands on it and make magic, to this year have it be distilled down at Mount Vernon. And the wonderful thing about doing that is that they make rye whiskey, and they've been doing that for a long time now with their own fancy mill and everything else. And then to have Lisa Wicker be present at your distillery when you were distilling it for the first time, and to have her be down at Mount Vernon and know what it's supposed to taste like, and still go, holy shit, this is good. When she made it at Mount Vernon and went, this is the best rye distillate I've ever tasted. At Mount Vernon, coming out of those stills. And for her, I know her experience with rye, and I know there's something here, it's just to get the next step, and not just for Rosen, because I don't want it to be the Bloody Butcher of rye. You know what I mean? I want there to be Sangasti. I want there to be, some more, I want to bring back the Egyptian white rye when I can finally find some. I want to be able to see some of those land races come. What's that?
I'll tell you guys, I think, here's the truth. I think Bob is going to do great with grain in the future. I think that what you're doing is going to work out perfect. One of the big problems with distilling right now is that most of the people who are passionate distillers don't own anything. So they don't necessarily get to make the choices. Yeah. But the other side of that the other side of that is that you give that 5 years, and this is one of the reasons, ironically, Todd, this ties back into the home distilling moonshining thing. You give this 5 to 10 years, guys. I've been saying this on this show the past several episodes we've done. You're going to hear me say it a lot over the next few years, because I've gotten myself back into reading some of the home distilling forums, etc. When this next wave of distillers that is currently home distillers get into the business, they are very aware of what people like myself, Todd, Erik, etc. are doing. Mm-hmm. And they're going to take it to a level that myself, Todd, and Erik have not even thought about. Because I'm telling you right now, some of the stuff that these guys at home are playing with blows people's minds when they read it. They have all the cool stuff, and they've done all the neat things that a lot of us haven't thought about. And they're very interested in those kind of specialty ingredients. Now, the other side of this is, and I'm not going to make any friends saying this, I'm sure, and I don't really care, obviously, but those distilleries that are willing to do those things and are willing to put their money in somebody like Bob's pocket, etc., they're going to make it because they are invested and they're passionate. The ones who are that are right now making themselves carbon copies of everyone else that's starting up right now because they hired the exact same engineer and they hired the exact same people to teach them. Yes. They're going to have a real hard time, not even 5 years from now, 2 or 3 years from now, they're going to be having a really hard time. The people who are differentiated and can tie themselves to both a local system, as you were talking about, Laura, but also to a system of quality, as Todd is talking about, as well as differentiated fermentation, distillation, etc. Those are the craft distillers, or whatever word you want to use for them, that are going to do well, and they're going to be around for a long time because they're going to be diversified. And there's a whole level of things that we've not even thought about. I mean, even with Rosen Rye, I bring up one of the old categories pre-prohibition. It was a very small category, but it was popular with split brandies. You do a half Rosen Rye, half whatever you want to do, brandy, right? TTB nightmare, but people will pay for it. You especially give them a couple years. 100% malted Rosen Rye would be cool. 100% malted Rosen Rye.
That's actually going to come out of Altered State is doing 100% malted Rosen.
Yep. And those are the things that are going to drive this into the future, because I don't, and obviously not making friends here, I don't think that this sort of middle of the road bourbon, middle of the road rye thing is going to work for everybody. I really don't. It's already not working for some people, just to throw that out there. So,
well, palates are improving. I think people are starting to appreciate the fact that, rye was number one before prohibition. And there's a reason for that.
Yep.
Yep. And it's called the flavor grain for a reason. And there's a lot more to come. I know, I'm just interested in seeing, what distillers want, because any work that people like myself want to do going forward, we want to do for you guys, mostly because you guys can use the raw grain. I mean, that's a point I wanted to make before, because we're talking about brewers and distillers, and why I don't work with brewers, because brewers want malted grain, and that's a middleman, which hikes your price. And that's, they want cheap. You need a facility that's putting out bazillions of pounds. Local maltsters can't really hang because it's just so expensive for them.
Yeah.
But it's like I need somebody who's going to buy raw grain direct from the farmer to put money into the farmer's pocket. And brewers can't do that. Distillers can, and distillers can buy in bulk, huge amounts, which is great.
Well, Lisa Wicker, that was such a fan, now has Heaven Hills largesse.
This
So
is true.
that's a phone call I'd be making. I don't know what their plans are for Widow Jane, but yeah, her budget just got significantly larger.
Well, and
This is true.
one of the points too is that so much of what I think all of us are trying to do is feature the grain, where with so many of one of the things Dick could never understand is why people wanted whiskey that in his opinion was overaged. And I feel like it's almost like the lactic Chardonnay or the buttery Chardonnays that everyone was taught to like, that nobody really likes buttery Chardonnay. I really don't believe they do, or maybe they do, but have they had a really amazing Oregon Chardonnay that didn't? Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's the perfect metaphor, because of course, that I could make a whiskey that charts for the Malt Advocate 90 plus. I know that I don't do that. I know that I didn't do that when I set out to make it. I am not making what the cool kids like. So we're out there with the 3-chamber, where the how do I say this politely? They just don't get it. They don't understand what we're trying to do, and don't understand. And it's been nice, actually. There's a lot of people that have been good enough on Reddit. Oh, wonderful. And so,
and I have this one too.
Yeah, make sure you guys drink that stuff, right?
Chris, yeah, I am.
Chris, you got bottles that are landing by. I didn't remember.
I had some for my birthday.
It's arriving, and you're getting. I sent a bottle of Dickel and a bottle of 3, but that's not where the cool kids are, and that's what the entire wine industry shifted. When I was in brewing over towards chasing that Robert Parker 90 plus score. So of course, what happens? Consultants start making the rounds, and they all start making the same damn wine, because the only way to stay open, or for anybody to buy anything, the wine bros, right? There weren't bros back then, or they weren't called bros, but they were there. Didn't want to embarrass themselves by showing up with a wine that was less than a 90, right? And that completely controlled that market. then the same crap happened with beer. And now the same thing is definitely happening, but where people are chiming in on the 3 chambers saying, you know, why is he charging this much, which is a fair question to ask. But there are other people trying to explain, you know, whose margins do you think are bigger, Russell's 13 or Leopold Brothers for the 3 chamber? Do I need to walk you through that you honestly don't understand who's making more money on their whiskey but you know, to your point, just in terms of everything that we make, you know, I was an eau de vie distiller. That's how I started. And so to me, I want you to taste the grain. And, you know, I'm very much in Mr. Stoll's camp. I understand the appeal of the more, you know, stuff that's north of 15 years. I get it. I understand it. But, you know, I've talked with Alan about this multiple times. All the malt whiskey makers make fun of it. If you get a chance to talk with a Japanese distiller or you know, really anybody from the UK that's been around the block, they make fun of American whiskey because it's so drenched in barrel. The distiller's not really doing any of the work for the stuff that's praised as the super fantastic stuff. And I've told tasters that, you know, so the press that before, it's like, if you don't throw the word corn out and you're in your tasting notes, that's not bourbon to me. It just isn't. It's literally it's what makes it bourbon is the raw materials and the grain that you use. And if the barrel is completely drowning that out to the point where you can't taste the corn, to me, it's just not bourbon anymore. We need to give a different name for it, you know, because of course we have these things written into law, right? That has to be a distinctive and taste. Now it says tastes like whiskey, but you should have that in the CFRs. Would that be wonderful? You have to taste corn, or you can't label it as corn. I don't know. I mean, I think that would be an awful fun rail to have to deal with. And I like these little restrictions that we have to follow, you know, to make our spirits. But at the same time, at the end, if you just want to call it whiskey, you can do whatever the hell you want. So you kind of get the best of all the worlds in terms of creativity. But I couldn't agree with you more, you know, about people not really wanting to change grain. The thing that I believe is that palates change. And they'll get around to it. And as people get more educated and get more interested in it, and, you know, why am I tasting this note? And you're already starting to see it, because everybody that gets into whiskey, and yes, blending is important, you know, yes, sourcing is important. And these contract labels are important. It keeps the industry healthy. But having said that, you're not being honest if when you got into the whiskey game, when you first found out, for example, there is no Pappy Van Winkle distillery, that you weren't disappointed. You're lying. I don't believe you.
Right.
That you're like, wait a minute, there's no, you know, this is made where now? You know, how many different places is Pappy Van, you know, it's a brand. It's not a whiskey. It's been made at a bunch of different places, you know, and that's fine. There's, you know, the Seinfeld, not that there's anything wrong with that.
You're rooting for laundry. I was just going to say that. Yeah.
So, but you know, I just, as they get a little bit more into it, they're going to start seeking out those bottled in bonds. You know, they're going to seek out these places with regionality where there's contact with a farmer, you know, where there's intentionality, and it's pretty easy to pick them out. And I agree with Alan about the samey, you know, the folks that are making alcohol, and you talk to them and there's just zero thought put into it at all. And then you've got other people that are just, you know, watch an episode of Moonshiners and get mad.
Yelling at the damn TV.
That's right. That's right.
A real quick thing here that I think might be a good place to wrap up, though, that answers your question there too, Laura, your statement. And it ties into everything that Todd and Erik just said too. I think there's a couple pressure gauges that have already started to go off. And the first one is the number of best of the year, blah, 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 whatever, that craft distilling has now made its way into. Whether we agree with all the ratings or not, doesn't matter one way or the other, but we're now part of the conversation, right? that's showing that people are interested one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether the people who are tasting those whiskeys want to include us really or not, maybe a different story. The other thing is we now live in a world where Jim Beam is putting in a craft distillery. I'm going to take that as a win. All right. For whatever it's worth, no matter what they do, they're calling it a craft distillery. We've sort of cracked the ice there. The third one is on a smaller scale, but it'll be interesting. Laura, I think in particular, keeping up with Robert in the next 2 or 3 years here.
Yeah.
The number of people that Robert may or may not be selling corn to who are on the hobbyist side of things right now, who in 2 or 3 years he's selling corn to, but they're no longer a hobbyist, right? And then that's going to be a really good idea of where this is going. Robert's
Well, I
going
can
to be
tell
seeing it
you,
firsthand.
Bob can tell you how much more he's doing. How, 7 years ago now, 8, was it, Bob, that you were dairy farming?
It's been 10 years since we could quit
10
milking
years.
cows. Yeah.
And now the farm is completely committed, so much so that he's got his neighbor growing for him, and he's buying more land, and he's cutting down some of the forestry on his property to put in more growing plots. And I mean, he is kind of the bellwether, I guess.
He's the Pablo Escobar of Western Pennsylvania. If he gets hippopotamuses, then we need to worry. But yeah.
I just want to put in like one little more point though, Alan, on top of what you were saying. Is the one thing that I can speak to is the history of American whiskey in Pennsylvania, rye whiskey specifically. And I can tell you that with the 200 different distilleries that I've written about, each one of them was different. Each one of them was doing something different. And yes, they all had maybe a 3-chamber still, but one had a 2-chamber still with a larger doubler. All their setups were different. All the ways that they did things were different, and they all had a place, and they all made money, and they all coexisted. And you're right, Todd. They also worked with all of the blenders and with all of the, rectifiers, and all that whiskey went all over the place, but they existed, and they did well. So we can do it again. Just need the raw materials, I think.
I agree.
That note, guys.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Christy.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, we're coming up in the 2-hour mark, so I want to respect everyone's time. So I'm going to tie this one up. I feel like we've got a lot more to talk about. This is a good point to kind of decompress and reconvene in a later date, I feel. So before we tie this one up, though, I'm going to have each person just give, a little bit about where you can find you online, where you can get your products. And I'm going to start with Robert.
Follow me on social media on Robert McDonald or Dancing Star Farms. I've got a website. It's called Dancing Star Farm Seeds. I pretty much post something every day as to what I'm doing.
He has the best green corn.
Corn porn.
Corn porn. Laura, how about you?
Laura Fields with the Delaware Valley Fields Foundation. I'm also the founder of the American Whiskey Convention, and you can contact me through either one of those websites, SeedSparkProject, .com, and AmericanWhiskeyConvention.com.
Erik?
Sorry, Erik at StollWolfe.com. Our website is Stoll, STOLL, and Wolfe, WOLFE.com. Primarily distributed in Pennsylvania, but we do ship across the state and have a tasting room in Lidditz and one in Pittsburgh as well on the Strip.
Todd?
Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers. You can find some of our stuff everywhere, and then some of the things we make are very hard to find. Yeah, that's about it. I already linked over to your Instagram account, Bob. Cool photos. Cool photos. I'll be sharing this with some other. I'm in a few distiller groups, and I'll be sure to let them know what you're up to, in case they're looking for what it is you're growing.
Alan?
You can find me yelling at my TV and drunken Facebook ranting. I am also now accepting bribes or payment if you are afraid to rant yourself on Facebook. If you would like me to rant about something for you, I will do that for the right price, happily. If you want a video, it costs more. And if you want me to do it as either Dusty Woads or as Mud Fossil, that's also extra, but that can be discussed. It's like OnlyFans, but for very angry people.
Right.
You can also find me at spiritsofFrenchlick.com, alchemistcabinet.wordpress.com, and all of our products at steelbox.com.
And you can find me on Instagram at Southbound Lane. Thanks for tuning in to Distillers Talk. Stay tuned for updates for our next show. You can subscribe to Distillers Talk on Instagram and Facebook, and also on iTunes, anywhere we can find podcasts. Until next time, keep the still fires burning. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Make sure that you let Pat Heiss know that Megadeth is way better than Slayer.